Good afternoon and welcome to the Yale University Art Gallery. Today we have the pleasure of listening to the first lecture in the series, Cézanne's People, Places, and Things by eminent art historian John Walsh. John, of course, needs no introduction to this audience. We know him as the transformative director of the Getty, who oversaw the creation of the Richard Meyer Getty Center in 1997. We stand in awe of his early career as a curator at the Metropolitan Museum of Art and the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston, among other museums. And reaching way back to his training, John graduated from Yale College in 1961 and earned his PhD in art history at Columbia University. Since 2000, following his retirement from the Getty, John began spending more time at Yale. Over the last 20 plus years, he has served on the Art Gallery's governing board. John also actively partners with our education department to help mentor the many students who pass through our doors here at the gallery. In his first lecture on Cézanne, John will guide us through the beginnings of Cézanne's career during his studies in Paris. And I just want to encourage everyone to come to the next two lectures as well, which will follow on Wednesday and Thursday of this week. I'd like to thank the Martin A. Ryerson Fund for generously supporting this series. Please join me in welcoming John Walsh back to Yale and back to this hall. Thank you, John.
Thank you. Thank you so much. What's funny? April Fool, right. Okay. Thank you. Yeah. Stephanie, thank you. I am grateful to be back at Yale, and I'm glad to be back with all of you. I'm hoping these three lectures can be a helpful introduction for some of you to Cézanne, or a refresher for many of you, whichever it is, and that we can form a better idea about what in the world Cézanne meant when he said that what he wanted to do was make of Impressionism something solid and durable, like the art of the museums. If you aren't familiar with Cézanne, or if you are, but if you're baffled by him, you're not alone. You've always had company. Here's a younger contemporary of his who made a project out of interviewing a lot of people about him. And he wrote in the end, "I have never heard an admirer of Cézanne give me a clear and precise reasons for his admiration." I'm going to give it a try myself. In these lectures, we're going to trace Cézanne's career of almost 50 years, looking at his three main subjects: figures and landscapes and still life. We'll see how he got started, an intense, eccentric Southern from France, well-educated, trained as a painter, who was drawn to Paris, who loathed the art world and the social elites, who defied or ignored the French official system during a time of tremendous change. We'll see how he was driven to Impressionism, how he learned what he needed from it and left the Parisian mainstream and stayed out of it for 30 years, and how he gradually developed his own inimitable ways of rendering the world as he saw it, with oil paint, with watercolor, in landscapes, portraits, and still life. And more important to him, how he rendered his own sensations. I'm going to pay particular attention to paintings by Cézanne that are within a few hours from New Haven and a couple of minutes from right here, dozens of them, and easy for you to go and see in the original. Well, let's start here, very close to home, upstairs, with a small picture of a very modest subject. Let's just look at it for a moment. Just let your eyes move around it. Take it in. I'll be quiet. And so you're standing on a narrow dirt road that turns a corner and disappears. At the right, there's the end of a building with a plastered wall and in bad shape, and past it, a jumble of lumber and rocks and straw and back-of-the-house stuff, and a little building with a chimney. There's a long shed in the distance. There's a stand of small trees. Moving closer in, you see it's painted with wide strokes of muted colors, browns, tans, grays, and greens. And there's a single bright red touch, tiny, but just enough to give a spark of life to an otherwise dull area. The leaves on the trees aren't green. They've taken on the gray of the clouds on an overcast day. And they're just scribbled onto the branches in broad, rapid strokes, especially there on the left side. Cézanne has picked a subject here, rural landscape, that occupied a low rung on the traditional ladder of status in painting and makes it compelling to look at, partly by the way he paints it. That's what he's been learning to do. You see this technique in another painting of the same period, also here, a view in the village where he was living, looking down a road that's squeezed between houses, and the exuberant yellow leaves on the left-hand side, painted with broad horizontal strokes, and on the right with yellow dabs, all of this framing a cluster of buildings. Same idea, different setting and viewpoint, different weather, much brighter with big patches of light spilled in where the road turns in the distance, making the space ambiguous. This picture evidently led to one of his first successes of another locale in Auvergne, looking out over the valley. We'll be back to this picture in a few minutes, but first I should ask, who was Paul Cézanne? Well, for the previous 10 years, in the art world of Paris, Cézanne was a provincial, a southerner who spoke with a heavy Provençal accent that often came in for ridicule. He wore a bushy beard, and he was apt to be abrupt and use crude language. All in all, he played the role of outsider in Paris, despite being every bit as bright and as literate as the more urbane members of the Impressionist circle that had formed around Manet and Monet and Degas, who were just 6 or 7 years older than he was. Cézanne's father was a successful merchant and bank owner in Aix-en-Provence, who eventually left Cézanne with a small fortune. Paul was talented enough and persistent enough to be allowed to study art at the age of 17 at the Free School for Drawing in Aix, and he followed the high school curriculum as well of history, Greek, Latin, science, and math, all the way to the baccalaureate. He and his best friends were all serious students, and also serious about hiking in the countryside and picnicking together, hanging out, swimming naked in the streams, and reciting poetry and reading aloud to each other novels by Victor Hugo and Musset and Flaubert. Their sex lives were entirely literary and imaginative. His biographer, Alex Danchev, wrote him as that schoolboy, Paul Cézanne, was a sensitive brute. After very little training in painting, he copied a photograph of himself at the age of 21, looking about as severe as a late adolescent can. He began law school. There's a sheet of his notes there, short on law, long on drawing. He struggled with his father over his career. Rebelliousness had been baked into his personality from boyhood on. At 21, he quit law school, and in 1861, his father accompanied him to Paris. His close friend growing up, Émile Zola, had already established himself in Paris and had urged Cézanne to come and join him in the big city. Another school friend in Aix had described Cézanne's personality, calling him that poetic, fantastic, magic, erotic, antique, physical, geometrical friend of ours. And from letters and reports, he seems to have lived in a kind of turmoil of imagination, frustration too, sexual anxiety, joy and anguish. He spent the next 5 years in Paris, off and on learning to draw and paint. At first he was discouraged enough to return to Aix and go to work for his father's bank. His father, in the meantime, had bought a fine country estate at the edge of town, a bastide called the Jade Bouffon that needed fixing up. And his son, who was still practically untrained as a painter, supplied these 4 allegorical panels of the seasons in a style that's almost comically refined. And in the middle, that black patch, is a portrait of his father absorbed in a newspaper, painted in a style that's almost brutally crude. When Paul returned home from Paris during the 1860s, he went on roaming the countryside with his little posse of close friends and sketching. These oil sketches are the beginnings of Cézanne's long interest in landscape. They are modest but competent, and soon they were going to lead to much more ambitious pictures. Back in Paris, he worked long hours at a privately run studio, not the official Academy of Fine Arts, where he was rejected, but doing what every art student did, drawing and sketching and advancing to this stage, which is studying figures from life. Cézanne became very good at that. And you can see at the left, first with a competent academic nude that he'd done in Aix a few years earlier, moving on in the middle to quite strong and expressive studies of figures in action or dead. For ambitious young artists, Paris in the 1860s was a magnetic alloy of money and energy and artistic and intellectual ferment. There was a radical makeover going on under the emperor's city planner, the Baron Haussmann. There were grand new boulevards, there were new railroad stations that served a growing rail network. There was demolition and new construction everywhere, making it easier to get into the city and around and out to the new suburbs. Some artists and writers might feel nostalgia for the lost Paris, Victor Hugo among others, but the themes of new art and literature in the 1860s and 70s were modern life. That meant modern life of the upward mobile, the amusements of the moneyed classes. Manet painted a well-dressed crowd here in the Garden of the Tuileries, and on the racetrack at the Bois de Boulogne up in the upper left, a park that was created by the emperor hardly 10 years before, that attracted everybody from aristocrats down through ordinary types, sporting types. As Zola showed him around to exhibitions, to collections in the Louvre, and also to the Luxembourg Palace, where more recent art was shown. About the museums, Cézanne wrote to a friend with typically mixed feelings. He said, "I'm not too cheerful I've seen them, the boring things in those enviable monuments. It's astounding, stately, overwhelming. But don't think I'm becoming Parisian. I've also seen the Salon. For a child born to art who says what he thinks, I believe this is really best. All tastes, all styles meet and clash. So Cézanne submitted paintings to the Salon and was rejected by the juries over and over. A couple of years before, there had been a very famous rejection by the Salon. This is in 1863, of this painting by Manet that broke many unwritten rules of decorum, even though it paraphrases Raphael and Titian. Manet's young nude model partying with men in street clothes was judged offensive enough to be rejected. The jury made so many arbitrary decisions like this, and there was so much furor over them, that the emperor ordered that space be made for the rejected pictures in an annex, the so-called Salon des Refusés. For the next 10 years, Manet's image of a picnic with naked girls remained in Cézanne's mind, and it comes up again and again in several strange pictures of his own. Here he puts himself lying down and looking on. Cézanne didn't submit anything to the jury that year. He was back drawing from models, trying to get admitted to the Academy, the straight path, that is, to a successful career that would involve getting work and being accepted by the Salon jury. He was taking Sunday hikes with Zola, and both of them chewing on their disgust at the entire official system of state training of artists, its conservative and even repressive policies. And he was spending long hours in the Louvre studying the work of artists that he admired, including the Spanish painter Giuseppe Ribera. He was inspired to make a secular version of this deposition of Christ, drawing from a live model at the bottom, and then painting a macabre scene of modern-day attendants preparing a corpse for burial. He studied his hero, one of his heroes anyway, Eugène Delacroix, whose horrific image of hell, described in Dante's Inferno, he copied in this little picture at the right, attracted not just to Delacroix's famous color and brushwork, but especially to the agonies of the damned. So if you're an admirer of Cézanne's landscapes, you might be startled by the paintings he made in his late 20s of sex and murder. At the right, in a vaguely classical setting, a pale, helpless young woman is abducted by a powerful young man. For the frustrated and loveless young Cézanne, imaginary wish fulfillment, I should think. He also made this little study of this subject in watercolor on the left, which was a medium that was going to become very important to him. And at the left, it's even worse. Against a stormy background and in lurid light, a woman holds a younger woman down as she's being stabbed by a male accomplice. Now, this isn't any particular lurid crime story that we can identify, and it's fluently painted in the manner of an oil sketch. But it's big enough to have been intended for sale and exhibition, like the abduction on the right. This is even bigger, this one on the right, 4 feet or so high. It's a canvas that we think he probably submitted to the Salon jury of 1867 and had refused. The little one is a preliminary sketch. It's huge on the screen, but it's only the size of a postcard. I've blown it up to give you a sense of the furious energy and color in it. It's derived, the painting, from an enormous wedding feast by Veronese in the Louvre. But Cézanne's subject is the banquet of the blaspheming Old Testament king Nebuchadnezzar, described by Flaubert in his novel The Temptation of St. Anthony. Cézanne imagined it as an orgy, with drinking and wild athletic fornicating. My teacher, Theodore Reff, wrote about these so-called black pictures by Cézanne. He said, throughout the 1860s, when other advanced artists in Paris were transforming realism into an increasingly lyrical means of rendering fugitive natural phenomena of seasons and weathers, the purely pleasurable aspects of modern urban life, Cézanne transposed directly onto canvas his blackest moods and his most violent impulses. Oh, while we're on the subject, Manet made another scandal at the Salon of 1865 by exhibiting a well-known artist's model presenting herself as a courtesan, looking at us unashamed, like a Venus in the Louvre, with a maid bringing flowers from an admirer or a client. Cézanne's late adolescent fantasies of women, amateur or professional, can take the form of jokes. Olympias making joke of men in the middle and the top right. Buildings here, and notice the suitors here are balding and they have Cézanne's own features. Or at the bottom right, the eternal feminine, an allegory of women, eternally adored by men of every class and rank, bishops to generals to painters, also looking like Cézanne, bringing tribute, all helpless fools. In the 1860s, Cézanne was also making landscapes, and he was very good at it. They were solid and competent, but not advanced, let alone a rival for Monet and Pissarro and a few others of the Impressionist circle who made landscape a specialty. We'll come back to landscape in just a minute. And here is Cézanne again, at about 26, with wary, defiant expression. He's draped his shoulders with a white cloth, I think meant to remind us of the broad collars of men in so many 17th century paintings by Velázquez and Frans Hals. It goes well with his big new beard and his massive balding head. But his painting technique is hardly old master. It is fiercely original, defiantly so. He didn't brush the paint, but scraped it on with a palette knife. It's a declaration of independence from doubting critics, from the politesse of the Paris art world, and maybe from his father, too. He recruited an uncle of his back in Aix to model for various character types and expressions that Cézanne invented for him. We have about 10 of these. He got more confident with the palette knife. This is one of several at the Metropolitan that invite you to look up close and get close enough so that the guards ask you to step back. If you do that, you'll see how he's loaded up the spatula with several colors for the face. You'll see the slabs of lead white for the cowl. He swipes on light pink for the highlights in the face. And you'll see how he creates the contraction of the man's forehead with a kind of serpentine trench. He made up a name for this rough style of his, couillard. we would say ballsy. Cézanne's hero in the previous generation was also a master of rough, abrupt painting. That was Gustave Courbet, there way at the far right, who had crashed through social and artistic barriers to present this painting, 22 feet wide, in the Salon of 1850. He was a contentious personality who'd also come to Paris from the provinces, not from Aix, but from Ornans, way east near the Swiss border. Courbet puts all social classes on one level, and he paints them all with a similar kind of roughness that denies privilege to anybody. At a pavilion in the 1867 Universal Exhibition, entirely devoted to Courbet, Cézanne would have had a good long look at this huge group portrait of his fellow citizens of all classes in the aftermath of the 1848 revolution and the overthrow of the monarchy. Courbet was painting landscapes as well, and some of them with a palette knife, which suited the rocky terrain around him, especially the group of tremendous views of the river Lou emerging from a grotto. Cézanne used the knife for various different effects. In this case, not scraping the paint so much, but sort of nudging it around into curved patches. One of Cézanne's most powerful studies of this period is of a well-known artist's model at the Académie Suisse, where he studied. Cézanne put aside the palette knife and used brushes for the flesh and the trousers. Claude Monet was so struck with this picture that he bought it and hung it in Giverny with pictures by Renoir and Degas and Morisot and other contemporaries that he admired. Now, Cézanne made a typically perverse career move. He submitted to the jury of the Salon of 1866 a portrait of a friend of his, a poet called Anthony Valabrègue. It was doomed from the start. It wasn't entirely lacking in charm, but it was painted with the palette knife, bound to offend conventional tastes. Valabrègue reported to a friend of his that one of the Salon jurors saw it and said it was not just painted with a knife, but with a pistol. Now, as usual, Cézanne had good company in being refused that year. That was the year in which Manet's portrait of an actor friend playing Hamlet was shown and refused. Manet had been scandalizing jurors, as you can hear, for several years with what was judged to be prurient subjects and slapdash technique. Well, speaking of technique, let's look at the two rejected heads. At the left, you see how thick and clotted Cézanne's surface is. You see the downturn of the bright red lips adding something petulant to the man's face. At the right, Manet used detached brush strokes for big highlights and for the shadows on the face, and you can see the marks of the brush hairs. For Manet and the Impressionists, loose technique conveyed animation. It was life. It was change. It was truth. For the Salon jury, it was just sloppy. These were shortcuts and violations of good practice. Never mind that those techniques had been used by Frans Hals and Velázquez and many other painters long before. But Manet's sins were polite. Cézanne's were flagrant. They were aimed at breaking with good manners and academic teaching. During the 7 or 8 years after this, Cézanne's technique changed. In the middle, you can see this man getting a more sympathetic inclination of the head. At the right, Valabrègue again with more erect posture and a narrower head. Brushwork is all livelier and more controlled. And the face is even more broadly laid on, now with a brush and knife, no pistol. This is his prescription. Flat planes of tone and color in surprising patches, blue shadow on the forehead, ochre touches in the beard, and of course the vermilion red lips and the tip of the nose. The background has an exuberant, watery pattern, and add the slightly abstracted gaze and the amused upturn of the mouth, and you've got a vivid, alive, delightful portrait. Even when he paints his father again, he's more merciful. The detail on the right, the detail here, I'll show you this. Yeah, the detail here shows you how sure-handed he was in laying on the broad planes of his father's face, And there's this bonus, the only decoration in the room, a still life, unframed, with raggedy edges visible, possibly still wet, almost certainly not chosen by Dad. The picture itself is back in Cézanne's hometown of Aix. It is a dazzling little demonstration of Cézanne's new style. The pairs are placed to produce what 50 years later Mondrian would call dynamic equilibrium. The cobalt blue cup balances the pairs, and the sugar pot serves as a kind of referee. He uses a palette knife to lay in the paint thickly, but with a confidence that no painter before, including himself, had ever shown. Again, a tiny study in watercolor and gouache, bright and confident, but flowers were not a subject he was going to choose very often. A year or so earlier, he'd painted this composition starring Baguette lying there, waiting for the knife. It's signed and dated, obviously intended for the Salon of 1865, but rejected by the jury, which would have found the style crude, especially applied to the plebeian kitchen subject. But it's a lot more confident than anything he'd done before. More ample composition, more daring in the way that the large, bright cloth mast at the right produces a kind of cantilever effect with pairs of eggs at the left and onions, and a milk pail that seems to hang out over the dark void. Several French contemporaries had been showing and selling dark, meticulously arranged and painted fruits and vegetables and kitchen gear like this. By contrast, Manet's still lifes were much thicker and looser. Cézanne had gone to Manet's studio to visit not long before this, and he may have seen a still life or two like this one on the left. But whatever suggestions the picture might have made to Cézanne about how to look modern, he ignored. Manet's is fully frontal, a table cropped at the sides, so that the normal pull of perspective is diminished. It's brightly lighted from the side, making shadows whose shapes play with the identities of what's casting them. Soft for the glass, sharp for the knife. Well, in the Louvre, there were, of course, several centuries worth of still life, including the greatest of all his French predecessors, Chardin. You can see his atmosphere and structure here. And in the detail on the left here, his modeling with colors. It's easy to imagine Cézanne studying how Chardin shapes that apple with pale green and yellow and red, and leaving us to imagine the sort of finer gradations in between. Cézanne used still life as a kind of lab for his experiments with form and color, and so did the painter who was going to become his mentor, Camille Pissarro. Pissarro, who studied, really inspired Cézanne and challenged him to go brighter, go broader. Pissarro's tablecloth is a cascade of strokes with the palette knife. The horizontal black band on the wall makes no particular sense, but it creates the fiction of distance. Very plain objects like the dish and the glass get extra life from the energy of Pissarro's hand applying the paint with strong detached strokes. Here, now Cézanne kind of turns a corner and tries out a different technique with smoother surfaces. Manet was the model for the brightness here and the layout, but his elegant food and upper-class damask is not the plainer things that Cézanne has to offer. Plus, it's not clear what's going on down below here. The plain plank that supports the kitchen stuff seems to be levitated. The visual weight is off to the right. The heavy crockery, and again, pairs of eggs and onions, all counterbalanced far over to the left by the bright spot, the lone apple, yellow and red, that's strayed away, but gets our attention. Nothing that Cézanne has done before prepares you for the still life he made for Émile Zola around the time he studied, served as best man in Zola's wedding. It's large, it's not large, I should say, but it is grand. The table carries a heavy linen cloth folded into 3 vertical slabs like concrete with formwork repeated by the row of indentations. On it, there's a grotesquely beautiful conch shell that dwarfs the cup and the lemon. And next to it, he's placed a silver vase that opens up like a flower. Behind it, a black clock in a black case sitting on a black cabinet. On top of the clock case is the lower part of a vase. And in a moment, we understand that both the clock and the vase are being reflected to us in a large mirror behind them. These were all objects that Zola knew and would have thought about. The clock has no hands, as though time were suspended while we look at all this, and that our time is limited. The massive conch shell, the remains of a living thing from the deep, displays its typical pinkish red edges. It's a collector's item that has emerged from a cabinet or wherever and into a parlor full of handsome things, all created to please or serve humans. Cézanne puts the objects into some kind of witty and somehow arcane conversations with each other and invites us to think about them. Cézanne's professional prospects improved after he was befriended by Camille Pissarro. You just saw a still life by Pissarro, who was an immigrant from the Danish West Indies. He's a landscape painter 10 years older who'd succeeded at the Salons with ambitious pictures like this one. He moved in 1866 with his family from Paris to Pontoise, up 4 miles from I should say that Cézanne also moved there to the village of Auvers, Pontoise for Pissarro in 1866, Cézanne in 1872. They were neighbors. Pissarro was 32, and Cézanne brought his partner and her later wife, Hortense, and their baby son at the age of 32. Pissarro recognized Cézanne's talent, and he knew how to deal with his abrupt and querulous personality. A decade later, it was Pissarro who mentored the unruly Dutch emigrant Vincent van Gogh. Pissarro painted himself at the right, and his protege and friend Cézanne at the left. And in between the hills of Pontoise, Pissarro showed this picture at the Salon of 1868, and Cézanne's boyhood friend Émile Zola wrote about it that it had a heroic simplicity and forthrightness. The painter's temperament has drawn a rare poem of life and strength, which is just what Cézanne hoped to do himself. Before long, they were both testing techniques, painting some of the same subjects, trading ideas about the art establishment, scornful, and politics, strongly left. Pissarro thought that Cézanne's landscapes looked promising. They were thick and forceful and strongly structured, like his own work and Monet's. Here at the top, the chestnut trees and fields at his father's house in Aix, all about light and shade, but muted, nowhere near Impressionist and in their handling of light, and very strongly rectilinear in design. In the middle, the opposite. Another early landscape here in the gallery, a steep ravine out in the countryside, above and below a mill stream, a composition of big swinging curves. And some, like the one at the right, have a kind of scary force that reflected something of Cézanne's volatile temperament. The scene on the Mediterranean here at L'Estaque shows a freakish early snowfall under a leaden sky that looks like nothing anybody had painted before, certainly nobody in the Impressionist circle. When Pissarro, for example, had painted new snow, it was on level ground, and he filled the picture with mild light. Cézanne's picture is ominous, it's threatening. Well, Pissarro thought Cézanne had better lighten up, literally, and learn to paint out of doors and finish pictures there and then on the spot, not back in the studio. Under the wing of Pissarro, Cézanne became a plein air painter. He took Pissarro's example and painted local scenes, moving around to various spots that Pissarro had painted and finding new ones, almost never including people in his pictures, but becoming more observant of everything else and using a higher key and newer color combinations and types of composition. And that's where we started today, where Cézanne was loosening and brightening his technique as he explored the villages and countryside with the encouragement of Pissarro. Let me just say a few words about the tall white house in the picture on the right, the house of Dr. Paul Gachet, whose name might ring a bell with you. He's the troubled-looking man in the print, the etching by Vincent van Gogh. Gachet was an eccentric but endearing and generous homeopathic physician, an amateur printmaker and a collector of the Impressionists. He was immortalized by this friendship with Van Gogh and the fact that he owned a studio and a printing press and plates and ink and tools and all that he used to teach etching to Pissarro and Van Gogh and other painters to make etchings. You can see a couple of Cézanne's efforts on the screen, and we were just looking with students at them this morning in our own print room. But he only made a few of them, and then he quit. With a paintbrush, though, Cézanne was a quick learner. This is one of the most delicious applications of Impressionist technique by anybody, the picture on the left. Effortless, it seems to me, lush, completely pleasing, without a hint of the dark, laborious side of Cézanne that we've known. His conversion seems almost too simple, but not for long. The high point of this period of discovery and growth for Cézanne is this painting on the left. One of the pictures he chose to include in the exhibition of Paris in 1874 that was organized independently by the Impressionists. Again, a narrow road or a path twists down between the houses and disappears. The geometry here is even more complicated. And now he's using paint differently. He's scraped it on with a palette knife in places, and then having built it up, he's using brushes here to create a pebbly, light-catching surface to get the crumbly textures of the plaster and the tree bark. There's not much shadow anywhere you look. There's a delicious view also at the very top, down to the village with bits of red, and out to the valley of the Oise River. What we've seen are the first steps Cézanne took in becoming an Impressionist, testing techniques to render his own way of seeing and feeling and rendering forms, what he called his sensations. His compositions are sometimes daring, and Cézanne's often more. And since most of the pictures aren't dated, it's not too sure which of them took the lead. Here, Pissarro on the left invents a side hill view from a climbing path back towards some houses. He contrasts the opaque mass on the right-hand side with an airy view on the left through the trees and out to the houses beyond. Cézanne's view at the right is abrupt. We look from under an overhanging branch right down on a cluster of houses. The walls and the roofs and field are foreshortened in steep perspective and composed like puzzle pieces, needing some work to reassemble if you insist on trying. Here, Pissarro paints the big view of, as I should say. And this is interesting and Freudian slip, because Pissarro and Cézanne are easily confused in this period. This is Cézanne painting the big view of Auvers from above, the kind of composition that Pissarro specialized in. But he usually framed the view with trees on either side. It's a delightful sort of crowding of little buildings nestled together and sort of nuzzling each other, fairly contained on the left by the hill, where he paints trees and shrubs with big sweeping strokes, as unruly as the town is orderly. Look at that corner. I mean, it's a mass of eccentric, slashing brushstrokes. And among the mild colors, you can spot some touches of bright vermilion. This back and forth of Cézanne and Pissarro in the 1870s was the subject of an exhibition 20 years ago, and some original writing by Joachim Pissarro, who was a curator here, also the artist's great-grandson. There were a lot of recently really fascinating pictures in the show, and as to who was leading and who was following, it seemed that either of them did, or both at different times. Here, for instance, Pissarro's motif of a road turning on the left is elaborated by Cézanne 5 or so years later. The road that curves all the way around and disappears, presumably borders that jumble of buildings at the right, where the cubes and the pyramids don't seem to be playing by the same rules as the other buildings on the left, let alone with the curved road. No doors, only a few windows, no people. The wheat trees are scraggly, and the shrubs are weedy. That idea of coexistence of hard-edged geometry versus what comes naturally in nature, curves, irregularity, struggle, was one that Cézanne was going to use all his life. Here at the left, Cézanne makes the viewer seem to be entering an empty farmyard, but between walls. Cézanne crops the view so as to make it strange, to change the psychology of the experience, which feels kind of cinematic to us. It introduces unease, even discomfort. And it's a foretaste of some quite suspenseful and amazing compositions that he makes in a rock quarry 20 years later, which you'll see in the next lecture. Both painters believed that their landscape imagery was advancing a kind of soulful proletarian revolution, but with particular sensibility, a taste for timeless French rural life away from the city, for deep forest glades and muted light, and direct, even rough execution with the palette knife. You can see Pissarro's scrapes in the trunks and also in the bright Impressionist patches on the bridge reflected in the water. Cézanne did this too, but unconventionally. He gave the whole picture surface a unified structure through that single slashing diagonal that's picked up by the other branches and seems to make the big tree at the right buckle with its force. Cézanne gets it all together in this marvelous composition. It's like a game of balance. 2 stone arches over the water, and between them a bridge, kind of like a balance beam. The right side has a dense grove of trees, and the left side a lighted wall, and in front of it bending tree branches, feathery, like birds' wings. A little closer in, you see Cézanne's amazing vocabulary of brush marks, the insistent parallel strokes, the hatchings that vary in direction and in density, and opaque, bright blocks for stones. As usual with Cézanne, something puzzling. There at the bottom, that bright white oval in the water, with a cause that you don't immediately identify. Got to be the reflection of a rounded white opening somewhere in the wall behind, which you don't see. But the artist asks you to trust it was there. From the late 1870s until his death, Cézanne divided his time between Paris and the various and its immediate environs, and the south, Provence, his native land, where the air was clearer and warmer, the sun brighter, and the landscapes irresistible to the eye, whether it was big views of hills and valleys or of the green surroundings of his parents' Bastide at the edge of Aix, the Jardin Bouffon. He didn't choose to stay there in the house because his stern, self-made father hadn't been officially notified about his son's little household and his long affair with Hortense Fiquet and their small boy, his own grandson. And Cézanne didn't want to risk his father's bad opinion, not to mention his allowance. He had a comfortable studio in the house, though, and finally the problem was solved in 1866 when his father died, and Paul inherited a share of the house, plus a yearly income of 25,000 francs, which is about $100,000 at the time. In the meantime, Cézanne had found a place free from family stress, the village of L'Estaque, a fishing village less than 20 miles down the road to the coast near Marseille, and with direct trains to Paris. They lived in the village on a few occasions, but Cézanne wasn't interested in painting conventional picturesque views like these. He did what he had done since boyhood. He hiked up the rugged limestone cliffs and steep canyons behind town, and he set up his easel looking out to sea. He found a landscape that was made for him. It was full of slashing angular forms and strong contrasts. Here he's composing a picture like the ones he had in Auvers, with a road twisting down into a jumble of roofs and trees and out to the utterly calm Mediterranean. He's used the parallel diagonal strokes you've just been seeing. And here what is striking is that the strokes don't curve to give the trees volume, but instead they change color, and they've changed value to do that. You take a minute to look in the middle of the picture here at the detail, and look how the forms sort of jostle each other and have outlines that sometimes coincide, so that you don't always know what it is that you're supposed to be looking at. Well, to get a railroad line through the mountains behind L'Estaque, the engineers had dug a tunnel at the head of this canyon and built a viaduct for the tracks. Cézanne picked a viewpoint that includes just the flat bend of the viaduct in the foreground to establish kind of stability, and he decided to mask the opening of the tunnel. What he paints is the tremendous rock walls and the pockets of soil that sustain the green Aleppo pines and the garrigue, the Provençal equivalent of chaparral, that are native to the region. Cézanne's image is one where human enterprise is concealed but alluded to, coexisting with the immemorial native landscape. This is a theme that gives life to much of his work. Here there isn't anything human, just the slender, snaky forms of the pines and the great broken masses of bare limestone leaning on one another as though they were been carefully stacked up there by giants. Erosion has softened the rocks, and soil has accumulated over centuries, and trees have taken advantage of that. Again, the detail lets you see the care that he used in putting in those short strokes that describe the green trees and the blues and the blue and tan rocks. This year, in 1882, Cézanne's friend Renoir had come to L'Estaque, and they actually may have gone out and painted together. Renoir took cues from Cézanne's work, and his painting is impressive in its more civilized kind of way, symmetrically composed, with what could be a grove of olives at the foot. Trees and rocks on the slope coexist in harmony. Cézanne also finds the odd backyard with views of the sea, partly screened by lavish foliage leaning this way and that. He paints it with a great variety of greens and tans and lavender, with strokes of many different shapes and directions. In other words, he takes a step back to Impressionist methods of evoking this particular scene. And we see that, for example, in this view of the Mediterranean by Monet, which has a much wider vocabulary of brushstrokes than Cézanne had been using. From other spots, he looked back eastward, across the bay, outside Marseille. In the foreground, the smokestacks of a factory, part of the expansion recently of light industry from Marseille that had begun to spread to the west and drastically changed a long succession of fishing villages. You see how delicately he's treated the ground and the trees, and at the left, the mostly white crusts of rock that assert themselves. In the mid-1880s, he did panoramas of the bay, but with differences of view and style. The Met's view on the right side was made from further up and gives more of the buildings and the small farms in the distance, and a prominent landmark in the far distance, the Basilica of Notre-Dame de la Garde across the bay. Meyer Shapiro wrote about this. It's a marvelous peace and strength that emanates from this work. The true feeling of the Mediterranean, the joy of an ancient nature which man has known how to sustain through the simplicity of his own constructions. Finally, Cézanne sets up his easel on the slope somehow and looks down to as much of the town of L'Estaque as he wants us to see, just some cubical bits with no great topographical interest. What's interesting and thrilling in the picture is what's downstage near us, the perilous position of the boulder that is tumbled down helpless and seems to be held prisoner by gravity and sort of mocked by the graceful dancing of the pines. Now, one last change of subject. back to still life. The faithful life coach and good example, Pissarro, had been painting kitchen still lifes with a brush and palette knife for sculpted effect, and so had Cézanne, as you saw, as a kind of lab for experiments. And he's also played with more daring compositions. Here is Cézanne's a move in the direction of sharp daylight from a window or a door that enters at a low angle and throws big dark shadows on the wall. The objects are bright and solid, and the colors strongly saturated. I think Pissarro's example probably helped tone down and civilize Cézanne's inventory of everyday kitchen objects. His balance is delicate. He puts the picture just a little off-center, balances it with the glass of dark wine. Pissarro's knife is doing its traditional work of establishing perspective, emphasizing it. And the apples in a pyramid displaying splashes of yellow. Apples become Cézanne's first love among his subjects. A challenge really close to obsession. He's said to have declared, "I shall astonish Paris with an apple." He painted them over and over, singly and in groups and in piles. He rounded up many types of apples, plain, red, variegated, yellow, green, and they joined the various dishes and bowls and bottles and jars and cups, like members of a rep company on a stage. He does the casting and the set design and directs, arranging and rearranging. In the picture on the left side, we know the locale from the wallpaper, which is in the apartment that he and Hortense rented in Paris after they left Auvers in 1876. The wallpaper and the floral tablecloth locates the scene in their dining room rather than the kitchen. The surprising thing is that the steep tilt of the table underneath, Cézanne's colors have also gotten milder and subtler. At the right, more apples in front of a big decorative wall panel, evidently painted by Cézanne himself. These apples are even more thickly painted in front of their little snowy mountain of a napkin. Cézanne once explained his fascination with painting fruits. He said, "They like having their portraits done. They sit there as if demanding pardon for changing color. They come to you in all their perfume, speaking of the fields they have left, the rain that nourished them, the sunrises they have seen." These compositions play games with us. Here, the straw bottom flask at the left faces off against an even bigger container, that heavy jar at the right, sort of refereed in the middle by a pure glass of water. At the right, again, across a sharp divide, a single bright red fruit cut by the frame. The expanse of white linen supporting all this is roughly laid on in thick white and gray. The picture is all about relationships, and it's about paint. He uses brushes and palette knife to push the paint over the top and up and around the fruit. Look at the glass neck of the flask. The broad swipes of the brush with gray. Gray for highlights, fat ochre paint for the straw. And for the two apples in the middle, an amazing patchwork of squares and trapezoids. In the Met picture, things have been tidied up. First he coaxed the white tablecloth into a wide hanging V, a pyramid upside down. Above it, a foursome of the usual apples are balanced in a right-side-up pyramid, echoing the diamond pattern on the wall, too. Left to right, there's a jug, a cup in the middle, and at the right, nothing. There's no corresponding third form, but the balancing act is performed by colors, surprise colors. At the right, next to the blue plum, a striking violet plum. For reasons not recorded, Cézanne did a couple of still lifes in more upper-class settings. No kitchens. This is a fine marquetry cabinet with gilt mounts, a silver flask, an embroidered white tablecloth. Perhaps not a great idea, I think. It all looks stiff, and the details are finicky everywhere, and the fruit dry, except for a few. I think it's a reminder to realize that even a very great artist makes work now and then that isn't up to his own standard. This, I think, is the opposite extreme. Just 8 apples in a little painting, arranged on a chair seat, each one posed a little differently. Their skins are red or green, each with parallel strokes in yellow and red. And just to quote a curator about this, Caitlin Haskell, it's like removing a lens that brought the painted image into focus. Cézanne's low-resolution pictures allow for a surplus of paint, which overtly directs attention to itself. This is a moment to look sideways for just a moment at this composition, and by the competition. Here's his friend Monet, who also has a sense of humor, I think. He has 2 squads of apples, big and little, separated in the middle by a little bunch of pale grapes. That mass of other fruits in the basket are positioned as like onlookers in a grandstand. He paints his apples differently from Cézanne's, though, with very careful attention to fine gradations of color, green, yellow, red. You can see, though, how radically different they are from Cézanne's. They have a pebbly texture, like Monet's other fruits. Cézanne has made his parallel strokes and our eyes do all the work. What's rare is that he's given the chair seat its own short curved strokes in ochre and blue, which surround the apples and seem to shiver in response to them. Now, none of this would you see in real life. I mean, the effect is not something that any other artists achieved, in fact, except, to my knowledge, one. And you see what I mean. Van Gogh's vision of life in the cafe downstairs from where he was staying, those disagreeable pulsing radiations from the sort of head-splitting gaslight overhead. Maybe the most successful of all these paintings at this period is this one at the Museum of Modern Art. I'd like to just stop for a moment and look together, and then move on. Look how it's arranged. The apples huddle next to the fruit dish, and on the other side of it, the small green apple is sheltered by the white towel. You can see how he paints with short, parallel gray and white strokes for the towel, which is a device you've seen him using in landscapes. The water glass up there, ever obliging, takes on a blue color of the leafy wall paper behind it. A composition that might otherwise be overloaded on its left side is pulled into balance on the right by the cloth spilling off the table and reinforced by the officious knife and the hot red specimen at the far right, the brightest thing on the table. On a bigger canvas, apples seem to have spilled out of a basket. There's a new menu item, too, at the upper right, the tidy stack of financier cakes. The upturned basket, whose means of support Cézanne points out by revealing the brick that holds it up. Okay, all more credible. But if you think that he's painting a credible structure, then try to figure out what the top of that table is resting on. Yeah, the towel suggests some sort of bi-level setup of the artist, but where's the juncture of the two levels? The artist is exerting his ability to be inconsistent, which he does, as you've seen in landscapes too. At this point, we're a few years from the last phase of Cézanne's amazing, extravagant compositions, like this one, where the furniture and the objects perform impossible feats. How could the basket be sitting on that little table? And at the right, what is that cut-off leg that casts a tidy little shadow on the floor? A ladder, an easel. There are lots of visual conversations going on here between familiar objects that jostle each other, but the artist brings harmony by suspending the laws of geometry, gravity, and perspective. We'll come back to this picture and this theme. Next time, though, we'll look at Cézanne's portraits and the landscapes in Provence. So please come back.